Morning. My name's Susan Friday. I'm the head of the Washington Center here. So I'm thrilled to be hosting this event today on such an interesting topic. And I don't have much to say beyond just turning it over to the experts, but I encourage you to follow the work of the OECD Washington Center to track what's going on. We follow the United States and Canada. This is an issue of great interest here, but there are many other things that we're doing that hopefully would catch your eye. So I encourage you to check out our website and maybe our newsletter as well. But to get into the meat of today's issue, I'm going to turn straight over to our Director for Public Governance, Mr. Marcos Bontori.
This is an important issue. I think there's lots of myths about the issue of illicit trade, and I think our first job here is to put facts on the table. And the OECD has been working on this issue for a large number of years. The report that that we're launching here today actually comes after many years of research, where we first tried to understand the size of the problem of illicit trade. It is a problem that is quite significant in terms of the size of the trade, but also the impact that it has on taxpayers, on businesses, on consumers. And we've been also working with a number of countries to put figures to that problem. Now, this report here, and perhaps putting this in the right context, we have been working, of course, on the issue of global value chains. And if you look at where value is actually being added throughout the chain, it is more often than not, and increasingly so, on the intangibles, on the intellectual property, on that part of the chain that is creating the most value. So this problem, also, if you put this in that context, you understand why it's so important that we address the issue of illicit trade. Up until now, and that's what's new about the report that we're doing today. Okay, we're putting figures to the problem. And we are, of course, approaching this from a criminal perspective. Okay, this is an illegal activity. We need to address it through the legal means, criminal prosecution, and having the right mechanisms to detect and prosecute this. What we're doing here is something a little bit different. We're saying, well, what are the root causes? What is really facilitating the growth, the exponential growth of illicit trade? And you may have noticed why is it the Director for Public Governance speaking about this issue? Well, because it's a governance issue. It is, at the end of the day, the weakness in some national frameworks, the weakness of the tools that we have at our disposal for international cooperation, that it is really the root cause of why is it that we have not been able to effectively stamp out illicit trade. So the effort that we have that in the publication we are launching today is very much an exercise in throwing light or where we feel the most important gaps are. I don't want to, we have the presentation itself, and I don't want to go too much into that. But we're going to be throwing lights at some of the areas where we feel merit special attention from all stakeholders, not only governments. What are the policy gaps? What are the main issues that we as a community who is concerned about this problem need to focus our efforts? I'm very honored to have here with us. And for those of you who are not familiar with the OECD, we are, of course, an intergovernmental organization. We are at the service of our governments. We provide advice to our governments. We provide a forum to our governments. And all the work that we do is at the demand and the request of our member states And we provide that platform. And here we have with us, and again, very honored with having the people who are in the driver's seat, representing their own governments in that work, and they are the ones that are taking the lead in pushing this work forward. So before we hear a presentation of the publication itself, you hear from those leaders, from those officials who have specific roles in the OECD networks, who will introduce to you how they perceive the problem, how they see the problem, and why they came to the OECD to try to address this problem. Then after that, we have the presentation, and then there will be some space for you to ask questions from all of us. So with that, again, thank you very much for being with us. And let me give the floor then to someone who has played a major role in moving this work forward. Is Tina Gabrielli, who is the chair of the OECD High-Level Risk Forum, which is in a way the parent network that has guided the OECD work in this area. Tina.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to take you just on a very short little history lesson just to kind of put this into context for you. So back in 2007, I was asked by the then Secretary of Homeland Security to stand up an office called the Office of Risk Management and Analysis. And for anyone that knows anything about risk, back in 2007, insurance companies knew what it was, but Homeland Security risk was sort of a new thing. And so I started reaching out to anyone and everyone that might be able to help in this new venture, and found that OECD had been looking at risks from that perspective for a number of years, and so started to work with them and work with the member nations from the member nation states of the OECD. And we sort of developed a grassroots project where in 2011 the OECD published something called the Future Global Shocks Report. When we finished that, the nations looked at each other and said, you know, this is too good to let go. So perhaps unusual for OECD, the nations sort of did a grassroots effort and said, this needs to keep going. And they formed the High-Level Risk Forum, which I became the chair of. We started the High-Level Risk Forum in 2011, and shortly thereafter I met my good friend and colleague David Luna, formerly of the State Department, and we said, this risk forum needs to look at all risks. And David was heavily involved in the kinds of risks that this task force ultimately examined. And I said, great, I'll do the greater, high-level risk forum, and why don't you run with this task force? And that's what he did. So, David, I'd like to thank you for your leadership over 5 years, for chairing the Illicit Trade Task Force. And if anyone wants to see what David looked like when this started in 2003, to have a copy of that first meeting. So, in any event, the work continued and under his leadership blossomed and went from mapping to actually countering illicit trade. And David was firmly of the belief that there was a convergence of all of the different types of trafficking that was going on, and the work, I think, of the task force has shown much of that. In 2014, the ministers of the varying nations that make up the member states of the member nations of the OECD issued a OECD guidelines on critical risks. This is important because the ministers don't often vote on these types of things, and they felt that this was important enough work to do that. And within that, if you take a look at it, is the types of issues that are being covered today by the report that's being issued. So it's been an interesting journey working with the OECD, and I have to say I started in my roots in law enforcement, and as a prosecutor I've prosecuted many of these kinds of crimes. So I can echo what you were saying, is that in law enforcement we do the very best that we can to take out the worst of the criminals that are doing the transnational organized crime type trafficking, but one case at a time is definitely the way you have to do law enforcement, but looking at it from a whole of government, whole of society approach is certainly a much smarter way, partnering with law enforcement to get the job done. And so I commend the work of this excellent report, and I would just like to say thank you for the opportunity to join you this morning. And I would like to turn it over to, I believe, my colleague from the Department of Homeland Security, Krista Brzezowski, who is one of the two new co-chairs of the task force. Krista?
Great. Do I have to do anything? Seamless transition. So Thank you, Tina, and thank you everyone for expressing interest in being here today. I'm very honored to be able to serve as the co-chair of this I'm new to it, the OECD Countering Illicit Trade Task Force, and very honored as well to be working with Chris Martin of UK, who will be serving as the co-chair with me. I think I speak for both of us, I hope, when I say I'm excited about the opportunity, and very much look forward to jumping in and rolling up my sleeves. We've done a lot of background on figuring out all the various great reports that have come out. I read through every word of these reports, so I'm very well steeped in some of the good efforts to date. But unlike Chris and many others here, I'm new to working with the OECD in an official capacity. However, before anyone takes great alarm, I'll let you know that I have long followed the work of the OECD and other international organizations, and often relied upon the data and the framework that they produce in my own work, in my own day job as the policy development official at the Department of Homeland Security, where I focus on trade and transport issues. In addition to some of the supply chain issues I work on, I looked to the OECD and, as I said, other organizations for inspiration, but also for just empirical data, for frameworks, for concepts, for models that we can leverage. And I thought I'd just touch briefly on one of those as an example that could highlight some of these areas where OECD provided long-term or was able to assist DHS, Department of Homeland Security, as well as the United States government on a long-term effort, and then have real impact on that. As folks may know, DHS, who follow this type of thing, DHS and about 200 of additional U.S. government agencies had been laboring for decades to create our version of a national single window. This is also known as the International Trade Data System, and it's a version of what is commonly known globally as a single window, which enables importers and exporters to provide required information in a single electronic transmission to government regulators. So this is a big deal when you're talking about so much data, so many government regulators, as well as involving industries from across the spectrum. This capability would allow the Department of Homeland Security and the range of all the other bodies, that regulators that were involved, to leverage automation and sophisticated risk-based targeting capabilities to focus on shipments that did warrant additional scrutiny, while, and this is important, pushing through the movement of goods that were legitimate, so we could expedite the flow of that type of commerce. With the United States, we've got $10 billion worth of traded goods and services going across our border each and every day. So this single submission and a single decision point in an automated environment allowed the United States to eliminate literally hundreds of paper forms to reduce the wait time for industry stakeholders that were trying to move goods across the border, and also, importantly to us, to increase our enforcement capabilities by being able to, again, focus on the bad stuff and facilitate the good stuff that we did want to see moving quickly through the system. I raised this effort first because we reached an important milestone recently where we completed the 99% of our single window, still working to further enhance its capabilities, but wanted to raise it as a great example about how the work of the OECD directly informed this policy development area that's going to have real-world impacts on the United States' ability to implement many of the things that Chris will talk about soon as being raised as government challenges for countering the movement of illicit trade. We went about, yes, this is an IT system, but it also had many, many processes and protocols that underpin it and allow it to process or work efficiently. And in developing those policies, those programs, those protocols, the United States government, we relied very heavily on OECD trade facilitation indicators, some of the raw data and the models and the surveys that are put out by the OECD and the work of other multilateral organizations. They helped us figure out what the key challenges were, what other models were in use globally and had the potential to be of value to us, to look across the system at bottlenecks and broaden our perspective from just addressing the problem as as DHS, as United States government, but also looking at the impact on the variety of industries that would be impacted, and also how it could enable better partnerships with our foreign government partners. And generally ensure that the approach that we took was not transactional and parochial, but data-driven and focused on the process, of course, but as well as on the fact that we wanted to be able to measure progress and output. So I mentioned single window, and as I said, I think this is particularly germane for the discussion today for a couple of reasons. You know, the single window is, at its heart, an IT system. Yes, we all understand that. But it was not an IT project, and this was one of the difficult things we had as we were developing it, is the programming was one thing, but it's understanding that that was an environment, that it's complex as the global supply chain and all its various actors were. It was an ecosystem of policies and programs and processes and capabilities and old ways of doing things that, if just digitized, would lead to unintended consequences. And so being able to collaboratively between industry and government and relying on real data in real models to be able to figure out how we wanted to create an ecosystem, not just an IT system, that helped move goods through the global supply chain. These tools that I've talked about, these that are part of the ecosystem and not just the IT, are some of the very tools that I think we all face, government and private sector alike, when we're trying to collaborate to close some of the gaps in the global supply chain system that allow others, bad actors, to exploit the network. Those looking perhaps to make money through illicit means, but also those with perhaps a more malicious intent. So again, at a strategic level, by working on that single window project, understanding the various inputs and outputs of that system and the ability for those inputs and outputs to be exploited by bad actors, transnational organized criminals, terrorists, money launderers, smugglers, gave us sort of a systems approach to the complexities and the challenges of this problem. And so I'll just end on noting a couple of the tools that I think will continue to challenge governments and private sector stakeholders alike as we collectively try to implement some of the suggestions that and recommendations of the report that Chris will talk to next. You know, at the very base level, everything is more and more informed by data. Governments are asking industry to provide more. We're using it in new and creative ways, perhaps scary ways to some. And we're trying to get our heads around using that data in a way that's going to be able to provide benefits to everyone, but also is respectful of folks' privacy, the need to protect that data, and the need for this data to be in and of itself protected. The challenges that I think we'll all need to face and overcome are ensuring the accuracy of that data, knowing who's providing it, in what format, through what means, and that it's received in a timely way. I think gone are the days when customs folks can kind of be handed a piece of paper at the border and take some sort of action. Governments are asking for this type of data earlier and earlier in the process in an automated capability. And I think that this is highlighting some areas where different governments have different capabilities currently to be able to have this data early in the process, have it in an electronic format, and have the culture and the capability to know what to do with it. That turns me to my next tool, which is a robust risk management framework and concept and culture. Being the custodian of huge repositories of data is almost worse if you don't have the culture, the capabilities to be able to make thoughtful use of that data. You can almost envision a sense where you had the information somewhere in some nook and cranny and were unable to act upon it, and find yourself even in a worse position should something bad happen. So it's not only the development of risk management frameworks and concepts and tools that I think will continue to be a challenge, but doing that in a way that is informed by the national priorities of your respective nation. And then finally, let me mention partnerships. I think it would be impossible to move forward on any global or comprehensive means to address this global and comprehensive problem if we weren't able to do so in partnership not only with other governments, but also with industry. That perspective that transcends sort of any one agency or individual or even government's purview, I think is invaluable to developing effective, implementable, and rounded policy recommendations that could then be tweaked to accommodate any one nation's needs and result in effective implementation. So it's those tools, I think, that we'll be focusing on through the OECD task force to address some of the challenges that I'll turn to my colleague, Chris, to outline.
Thank you, Krista. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. It is truly an honour for me to chair the Countering Illicit Trade Task Force with Krista, and I look forward with her to pursuing the course set by our predecessor, David Luna, and I'd like also to take the opportunity to express my gratitude to him and to Tina, and also applaud the commitment and the energy of the Task Force Secretariat, and Peter, and other Task Force members. So I come to this more as a practitioner with 40 years experience in customs service, most of it in criminal intelligence and investigation work. And I have the privilege to work here in DC, and my job involves engagement with not just customs, but with federal agencies, regulatory agencies here and in the wider region. So that should provide us with some reassurance that the quality of that liaison is strong and the levels of cooperation we receive and we give to one another is strong also. I'd also like to invite anybody who would like to take a photograph of me. Please do so now and show me what I look like in 12 months' time.
We know how David looks.
Anyway, but you know, to take Krista's point, you know, the automated commercial environment, single window, what a terrific enabler to be able to allow customs and other border agencies to differentiate between the bad and the good, to allow better focus on the trade which is suspect, which is dangerous. So from a personal point of view, I was introduced to the task force in its early days, and I was very pleased to contribute to that initial work plan, which was to chart the flows of illicit trade in order to better quantify the risks, the illicit markets, the criminal organizations and other networks operating in the shadows of global trade. And then from there we moved to that second phase to analyze and study the measures needed to counter illicit trade, and with the aim of providing recommendations on institutional capacities, which is what brings us here today. The launch of the report, Governance Frameworks to Counter Illicit Trade, it just adds further to the momentum achieved through the study, the Trade in Counterfeit and Pirated Goods, which was conducted jointly by OECD and the European Union Intellectual Property Office. And the results presented in that report were based on a unique global set of customs seizure data, complemented by EU data, provided by DG Taxud, by the US Department of Homeland Security. The quality of that research and the analysis provided some really thought-provoking outcomes. The enormity of the challenges we face with global trade in counterfeit goods. The report estimated as 2.5% of world trade in 2013. And then a more alarming picture for the European Union, in that context, where counterfeit and pirated goods amount to up to 5% of imports. But it's not just the loss of government revenues or commercial profits that are at risk, but supply chain integrity and the safety and well-being of our communities. So the challenges we face in countering illicit trade are multidimensional, but they're underpinned, in my view, by two fundamental themes: collaboration and consensus. Collaboration between law enforcement, regulatory authorities, policymakers, industry and academia, and consensus between all stakeholders as to the seriousness of the economic and social harms caused by illicit trade, irrespective of the commodity type. So last week in the UK, we saw the conclusion of criminal proceedings with the conviction of a man who sold dangerous counterfeit airbags online. When our colleagues in the City of London Police raided his premises, we discovered that he'd sold 680 airbags, bearing the brand names of 11 different car manufacturers, all to unsuspecting customers. Now, that case was initially referred to Homeland Security investigations by automotive industry partners. The Homeland Security response was to share with me, and for my part, to share with our partners in the United Kingdom, who initiated an investigation and responded swiftly to this public safety threat. It was a really labour-intensive operation because at the time the search warrants were executed, we needed to take bomb disposal squad in because of the volatility of those counterfeit airbags. And every customer, all 680, needed to be visited, not just for the purposes of providing witness statements, but to make safe those airbags. And I think it's illustrative of the collaborative nature realised by the US National Intellectual Property Rights Coordination Centre, which hosts representatives from multiple government agencies and industry representatives. And I think it's a model that certainly the UK and others should aspire to. And only yesterday I was with other international partners in an outreach event hosted by the Food and Drug Administration Office of Criminal Investigation. And there we had a focus on counterfeit and substandard pharmaceutical products and medical device cybersecurity. So whilst I think we can take encouragement from the breadth and quality of law enforcement and industry and engagement, we simply cannot become complacent. So towards the end of last year, I took part in a review of the UK's tackling tobacco smuggling strategy. And in doing all of that, I was reminded of a quote made by the French poet and essayist Paul Valéry, who said, "The trouble with our times is that the future is not what it used to be." and how apt, because during the 18-year life cycle of the UK tackling tobacco strategy, we have observed that criminal organisations are adept in adapting to changing legal or regulatory environments to elude discovery and interdiction. So when the strategy was introduced in 2001 to drive down the illicit market in the UK, the penetration was in the region of 25%. We introduced supply chain control measures, which took effect, but we then witnessed a change. So the smuggling of genuine product was overtaken by counterfeit production. So we redeploy, we recalibrate our response to counterfeit, and as that began to bite, we then saw the large-scale production of off-brand or cheap white cigarettes as they're commonly known. And yet more recently, we've observed the proliferation of clandestine factories across Europe. So in December of last year, the Guardia Civil raided a factory in Granada in Spain. The factory was capable of producing 2 million cigarettes per day, and the organised crime group responsible had created their own brands and packaging. 8 properties in Granada and Malaga were searched. The arrest of 18 people. Discovery of 10 tons of tobacco, 4 tons of fine-cut tobacco, 4.5 million cigarettes, and all of the machinery. But of particular note is that the set-up costs for this enterprise came to €3 million. So it was by no means a cottage industry, but a significant commercial enterprise. Yeah. And experience has shown us that trafficking routes for all illicit goods are ever more complex, subject to dynamic changes across transit points, and at times at odds with normal commercial practice and viability. So we, law enforcement, other stakeholders, we must strive to be alert and as flexible as criminal organisations are in determining our response to their adaptability. Now, the role of free trade zones and the opportunities they provide to illicit actors has received significant attention within the Countering Illicit Trade Task Force, and recent joint OECD-EU IPO research on counterfeit trade routes reveals a reliance on FTZ economies. There's a growing body of evidence that certain free trade zones are being used as assembly and distribution hubs for illicit trade. And the lack of adequate oversight by law enforcement authorities, coupled with low incentive to monitor activities within these zones, adds to their vulnerability. So to address these issues, the task force is beginning to administer a process with member countries to develop a shared understanding of possible solutions, with the overall goal of developing clear guidelines to promote clean and fair trade. And this subject will be discussed further at the 6th plenary meeting of the task force in Paris on the 15th and 16th of March. We'll also, at that meeting, consider the role of intermediary market actors involved in various economic processes, including those associated with sustained increase in online shopping. And this growth requires governments to adapt their controls too, to combat the supply of counterfeit and substandard goods, and to ensure good tax compliance and a level playing field for all businesses. The OECD EU IPO study indicated the growth in the use of small parcels employing postal or fast courier routes to carry counterfeit and pirated goods, and this presents a growing challenge to customs administrations to adequately target and seize suspected fake goods, because the relatively low volumes of goods also impacts the cost effectiveness and desirability of legal action in those cases. At the meeting there will also be a session on how corruption enables illicit trade in wildlife. And global networks of criminal and terrorist actors have used rhino and elephant poaching as a means to derive funds for the financing of other more sinister activities. And in many cases the proceeds also contribute to corruption locally. So the task force dialogue we have in 2 weeks' time will also involve colleagues involved in the London 2018 Illegal Wildlife Trade Summit. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the value of that cross-engagement of the OECD with other intergovernmental organisations, business alliances and civil society groups with shared interests. So I would say in conclusion that the challenges we face are many, but a shared recognition of the threat will continue to drive effective, mutual beneficial outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is, again, you see from this introduction that this is indeed a major policy issue, and the task force to counter illicit trade is playing a major role in providing initial responses to the challenge. But let's go straight to the report itself. Piotr Stryjowski is the lead economist who has guided this report, and he will introduce you some of the main conclusions. And then after that, we will open for any comments or questions or violent objections from you.
Thank you, Marcus. My name is Piotr Stryjowski. I'm an economist at the OECD supporting this task force on counter illicit trade. Practical comment. The copy of this presentation should be in your handouts, because I can realize that not all of you can see the screens. So today, I'll briefly present you the findings of the report, Governance Frameworks to Counter Illicit Trade. But before I get there, let me guide you through our path of research that actually led to this publication. Let me present you the evidence that we've collected that kind of provides a foundation for this piece that we'll have today. This was done, of course, at the task force on countering illicit trade under the leadership of David Luna. Thank you, David, for being here. And before I go to the point about what we know about illicit trade, let me refer to what Marcus said. Why do we actually look at illicit trade, especially like in counterfeits? And there are several reasons that shape the current economic conditions that make illicit trade particularly attractive for criminal actors. And if I was a criminal, I would be looking for profit opportunities that are easy, high, and safe. And today, illicit trade, in particular in counterfeits, looks like a very lucrative business where risks are low. As Marcus said, global value chains is something that we observe. The term global value chains refers to the fact that the term made in becomes meaningless, obsolete. And let me just look at my favorite phone, iPhone. I'm not making any ad here, but it says designed in California, assembled in China. So there's no even made in on your iPhone. And actually assembled in China, using intermediary products from all over the world. To produce a single product, you need to engage very complex supply chains with many actors on the way. So in a nutshell, it's very easy, if you are a criminal, if you are a trafficker, it's very easy to pollute such complex supply chains. It also means that the value of intellectual property, ideas, concepts, brands is growing. Apple was designed in California, designed in the US. Design is something that matters. Design is where the value is. And of course, the value that is in design can be stolen easily, copy-paste, steal, become a counterfeiter, become a trafficker, earn money. On top of that, you have booming e-commerce, where supply meets demand directly, which makes enforcement difficult, as Chris said. It's so many small parcels that result from this. And lastly, we see, say, a bit lack of coordinated response with low penalties, so which means that the risks are pretty low. In a nutshell, the environment offers high profits, lots of money, easy money. And to study this, the OECD has employed some data-oriented research. The data we have comes mainly from customs, from, as Chris said, Digitech Suite of the European Commission, World Customs Organization, and from CBP. And I see Michael Walsh from CBP here, so thank you for giving us the opportunity to have access to this data. The data are very rich, and I'm actually an economist. I graduated from econometrics, but I will not say a word today about formulas and data. However, thank you. Every single report that you see here, I would say 2/3 of this report is an annex with lots of formulas, lots of tables. Not only just they are beautiful, but it's just to ensure transparency. It's just to ensure that there is nothing here that we kind of sell you under the table without explaining the details. We are fully transparent. And also, if you have any questions about econometrics, at the end of this presentation, you will have my email address, so feel free to drop me a line. But as a result of this analysis, what we have so far in these reports is a set of neutral, robust, quantitative photographs, pictures of illicit trade that today we complement with another picture that shows the policy gaps. And these pictures about illicit trade tells us there is a problem. There is a big problem that is global and that is severe. As Chris said, $461 billion, that's the value of trade in fake goods only. Fake goods, counterfeit goods, that's just a share of the total pie that is illicit trade. $461 billion, that's a lot. Going back to Apple, this is almost twice as Apple's yearly revenues. Lots of money, up to 2.5 of all trade. And what we see is that innovative ICT sectors are at a particular risk, where 6.5 of trade in these products are fakes. 6.5. So it's not only luxury products. It's not only fancy leather bags. Of course, it matters for them a lot. But what's at particular risk is ICT products, with lots of value added attributed to brands, patents, ideas. That's where the criminals target. Where these companies are located that suffer from counterfeiting or that are target of traffickers, well, basically any innovative company, any company that relies on ideas, that relies on brands in their business strategies, any company that produces products where a certain share of value added is attributed to ideas that you can steal, such companies at risk. United States is on top. US companies are hit the hardest, but we also see that, for example, Chinese companies are there. For counterfeiters, what matters is money. They look for money. They have no sentiments. Money and no risk, of course. What we also see is that the trade routes are very complex. Illicit trade is a globalized business. It's not like next door trading. No, it's a global new global economy. It's a very, I would say, it's very insightful to study this using all these math formula that we will not talk about, because it shows that this is a business of the 21st century. If you look at the trade routes of, say, counterfeit goods, you see a very complex, yet powerful map that minimizes risks, that maximizes profits. And in most analyzed product categories, China is on top of producer of counterfeit goods. But what we also see is a set of global hubs for illicit trade. And these transit points are misused for many reasons, like document cleansing, to make life of our colleagues from enforcement harder, to establish assembly and distribution centers. This is particularly the case of FTZs. In such global hubs, well, we can see the main ones being in Hong Kong, UAE, and Singapore. Not poor countries, not a developing countries, they're well-developed countries with great infrastructure that is being misused. What we've also produced is a set of, say, maps. Here is for counterfeit products, where a dot refers to producer of counterfeit goods, a square refers to transit point. This is an aggregate situation. You can see that China dominates. And this is, say, for one particular sector, ICT products. $121 billion. That's the world trade in counterfeit in ICTs. And the main routes lead to the United States, European Union, and to the Gulf region. So you can already see that this is a very globalized business with many intermediary actors. So a reply should also require global coordinated response. But before I go there, let me just say one more thing. So far we've seen that the scale of the problem is big. But what are the losses? I mean, the scale is big, but who's suffering? And at the OECD, we have the black box, econometric black box, very nice one, that enables us to produce some estimates about actual losses experienced by countries that suffer from counterfeiting. So far, we did a study with the United Kingdom, excellent collaboration, Chris, kudos to your government, that shows that short-term losses amount to 60,000 jobs lost annually. 60,000 people in the UK lose jobs because of counterfeiting. Almost £4 billion lost for the government. We see that consumers lose £100 billion on price premium. UK companies experience 8.6 billion losses in sales. These are money that actually affects UK companies. These are people who don't have jobs. This is a serious problem, not only for mythical companies somewhere there, but also for regular people who can find any employment. So that's something what we know about counterfeiting. We know it's a global problem. It's truly global. We know that it's serious, it's big. You know, it has several severe consequences. But what we can do? What's the answer? Well, at the OECD, our role is to help the governments to develop answers. But apart from assessing the scale of the problem, what we can do also is to check what are the policy gaps, what are the enablers that make this sort of criminal activity to thrive. But what we also see is that the response is very difficult. Traffickers, as I said, operate globally. They don't care about boundaries. So an effective response would require coordination within countries, between various agencies, and between governments and industry, as well as across countries, because as we saw, the scale of the problem is really global. And that's the report that we have today. This report checks what are the immediate responses, or what are the possible responses, what are the 3 policy areas that could be addressed to counter illicit trade. And the report also presents some enforcement practices on IP in BRICS economies. That's part 2. So as Marcus mentioned, this report introduces 3 areas, policy areas, for governments to consider in addressing this threat. The first one is penalties and sanctions. Penalties, sanctions, key deterrent. As I said, high profits, low risk. In theory, sanctions should increase the risk. But just as I guess Chris mentioned, criminal networks are very skilled. Criminals are smart, and they operate very dynamically. So basically what this part of the report says is that criminals adapt so quickly that no single penalty scheme can be effective. Criminals choose ways to minimize risk very effectively. So the success here depends, of course, on sanctions available for offenses, but also on the ability to enforce these sanctions and the capacity to cooperate with foreign authorities in order to exchange the opinions, in order to learn quickly what's going on in the area of illicit trade. In many of our meetings, well, the last one was in Alicante, organized together with EU IPO, we've heard that counterfeiters, in the context of counterfeit trade, react much quicker than any EU customs officers can respond. Before the information is shared from, say, Italy to the UK, the traffickers respond much quicker, and they go really 2 steps ahead. So here the issue is to improve it, to go like from 2 steps ahead to 1 step ahead, and then to close the gap. Another area refers to small parcels. Well, what we see from our previous studies, what we see from the study that we did jointly with the EU IPO, is that there is a sharp growth in the use of postal and courier streams. Well, of course, this is related to the online sales, to the booming e-commerce, and that's nothing bad about that. I mean, e-commerce is great, and, well, I love e-commerce. I love Amazon, I love Zalando, my wife loves Zalando as well. It's fantastic, it's great. But at the same time, enforcement related to e-commerce transactions is very costly and difficult. So here the trick is how to maintain the fantastic benefits from e-commerce while addressing the dark sides that it creates. And here success depends on engaging with industry, engaging with courier and postal companies, with e-commerce platforms, and of course looking at best practices, building on best practices, looking at data availability. Data is essential, not only for econometricians, but also for effective enforcement. The third pillar refers to free trade zones. Free trade zones are a great thing, a great invention to boost trade. But unfortunately, they boost licit as well as illicit trade. And here, the reduction in red tape, in bureaucracy, often results in higher growth shares in illicit trade. So here the success depends on improving zone supervision, information requirements, penalizing misuse of free trade zones, security screenings, also strengthening collaborations with stakeholders, also those that are hit, and developing codes of conduct, voluntary code of conduct for free trade zones, as well as formalizing responsibilities of zone operators. And here let me mention that within 2 weeks there will be this meeting of the task force on countering illicit trade in the beautiful city of Paris, during which there will be 2 sessions devoted to the issue of misuse of free trade zones. During that meeting we'll also launch a report that was done jointly with the European Union IP office that, well, I can say confirms quantitatively the fact that free trade zones are indeed misused by counterfeiters in illicit trade in fake products. Coming back to this report, the second part of this report, its second pillar, refers to enforcement practices in BRICS economies. Well, these economies are very important global players, and their engagement is crucial to effectively counter illicit trade. Without them, well, we must get them engaged. And also, we should not forget, that's a photograph that we have from our studies, that companies from these countries are also hit. We should not forget that there's fake Huawei phones or fake Havaianas flip-flops. I mean, these companies also hit. Counterfeiters or traffickers, they care about money. They have no national sentiments. And these 2 reports show that this is the case. This is the case. But here in this report, we did some econometric analysis to look more in depth into the BRICS economies and their situation. So when we look at counterfeit trade in the context of BRICS economies, we can see that there's only one economy that actually dominates as a source. It's China. India plays also some significant role in several sectors like pharmaceuticals, but it's China that is the global hub of production of counterfeits. When we look at seizures only, this graph is very illustrative. Economies that are on the upper half of this graph are net importers of fake goods. Economies below are net exporters. And we see that China is the key net exporter. And this is even not taking into account the fact that the routes are very complex and there are many intermediary points. This is really direct exports and imports or direct smuggling of fake products. However, when you look at legislation, when you look at practices as they are in the books, you can see that these economies perform pretty well. China, as described by the Global Intellectual Property Center Index, well, scores very well. So here are our suggestions, here are our conclusions, that here the success crucially depends on the adequacy of enforcement, the level of resources in terms of money, in terms of people, in terms of the tools that the enforcement authorities have, in terms of tools that private rights holders have, and also in terms of international sharing of experiences. Please don't forget the maps. It's a global problem. International sharing of information, international sharing of best practices is essential to better understand the problem and to better develop good and targeted and effective policies to combat it. Another point is appropriate deterrence. So penalties should be reviewed if they work or if they are implemented. Next, public reporting on counterfeiting infringements should be reviewed as well. And of course, accession and implementation of international IP agreements. And lastly, well, education and awareness. I've heard it many times, and for long I was a bit skeptical about this issue of education and awareness. But having met many people who are telling me that this is not a serious problem, that this is just an anecdotal thing that does not matter neither for people nor for companies or for governments, I think that education, public awareness is important. People must realize that this is a serious problem with serious consequences, not only for some companies, but also for all the societies, all the people, for governments. So what are the next steps? Well, of course, we will continue working on deepening evidence. We will provide more and more robust results, and we're really glad to have many people from the government on board, because our role is to provide you with results, to work with you, for you, to provide you with something that is relevant, that can help you, that can be interesting. And as I mentioned, on March 15th, we will launch the OECD WIPO report on the misuse of free trade zones. There's a number of other reports in the pipeline, including a report on small parcels and express services in the context of trade in fake goods. We are also developing country-specific analysis, as we did with the United Kingdom. There's also another one with Sweden, there's one with Italy, and of course, if the US will express their interest in such a case study for the US, we are more than happy to do it. And at the OECD, as Marcus said, we are an organization that produces shared results for our stakeholders, for member countries. We're a platform to engage in a discussion, and we're ready to continue to work with all you stakeholders to forge a consensus on future actions to counter this threat. And here I stop. I'm glad that I haven't used any equation in my presentation, but if you feel like asking me about any technical details, I'll suggest you do it by email. My email address is here in the presentation. I would say now, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Piotr. We are running a little bit ahead of time. That gives us a little bit more time before Mr. Vishal Amin joins us. He's from the U.S. Intellectual Property Enforcement Coordinator at the White House. So let's open the floor. If you have any questions, any comments, or objections about what you did. Gentlemen.
I got a question.
No violent objections. Just simple objections. peaceful.
All right. Can you hear me? Is that on? Okay, well, still on time. My name's Paul Massaro. I work for the U.S. Helsinki Commission. Oh, there we go. All right, it popped. Wonderful. I'm a policy advisor for international economic policy, and I focus really on anti-corruption. I really started out in illicit finance issues, and then I realized, wow, illicit trade is this massive problem, and then, they're connected in a really meaningful way. And, I see all of these things as the problem of globalized corruption. And that's really what we're fighting today, is a globalization that's been in large part hijacked by criminals, really powerful criminals who in certain cases have captured states. So while I think it is really meaningful to say, hey, BRICS, other guys, help us out, please be a part of our enforcement regime, in certain cases, the counterfeits are being encouraged by the government, are part of government frameworks. For these cases, I'd like to draw your attention to a really neat law on the books called the Global Magnitsky Act. And the Global Magnitsky Act, we had a lot to do with that over at the Commission. It passed in 2016. The first designations came out last December, a really powerful list of designations that target human rights abusers, but also those involved in grand corruption. And again, illicit trade is fundamentally, to me, a grand corruption issue. I would encourage the OECD as a forum and an organization for policy synchronization to look at the Global Magnitsky Act and think, this might be a really neat tool for all of us to adopt. Because obviously, the United States can do a lot, but in the end, if you can hide your money, because it's visa bans, it's sanctions, to go back to the sanctions issue. It's sanctions on individuals. It's targeted sanctions, visa bans, and asset freezes. But if you can hide your money elsewhere, you can go spend your money elsewhere, it's much less effective. And, as I think we all know, these individuals, these global criminals, they love to, steal and pillage and take money from their own countries, but then they love to come to the West where they spend it, they buy villas, they real estate, whatever else. To what extent would that, could the OECD be a meaningful forum for the adoption of such a policy, the synchronization of such a policy, and to what extent would that be helpful in your experience in the illicit trade department? Obviously, in the illicit finance department, it's powerful in the counter human rights violations, but in the illicit trade department, in your view. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Massaro, for this comment. And I think let me just start answering some of that if Piotr wants to come in later. You touched on a very important point, and I think it goes to the heart of the role the OECD can play in issues like that. Historically, the OECD has indeed played the role of providing a forum where countries can come together and address those problems that are common problems. I mean, we have at the OECD, we host the Financial Action Task Force on the issues of terrorism financing. We host, of course, the Global Tax Forum, where we are ensuring that there's enough transparency and the tax havens are playing by the rules. So there's less and less of a place to hide if you want to evade your taxes and not abide by your responsibilities as a taxpayer. And all this work very often it comes from a leading group of countries or a leading country. And I'll give you an example where the U.S. Has played a leading role in the work of the OECD is the issue of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which I think is maybe already 20 years old, or if I'm not mistaken. This is a clear example where the U.S. took the lead, where there was clearly a problem of let's say the U.S. companies having some type of practices that became outlawed in the U.S. And very quickly the U.S. companies realized that they were asked to abide by higher standards, but their main competitors, including in most OECD countries, did not have the same standards. So whereas corrupting foreign officials became a crime in the U.S., in other countries, in France or Germany or Japan, for instance, not only it was not a crime, but you can also deduct from your tax. The whole system was not working well. And working with the OECD and through the OECD, we started having that discussion, and that led to the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention. And so that, again, is a clear example of what U.S. taking the lead and internationalizing some disciplines to the benefit of all. Now, the challenge is today in 2018 is to ensure that some countries which are not members of the OECD also abide by the same rules. That's again a different issue. But we're working hard with the U.S., with the Europeans, and other OECD member countries to ensure that becomes a real, truly global standard, where other countries that are not yet ratified or not yet applied the rules. So what you're saying is very, very important. It goes really to the heart, and I think we should definitely look at that example because you're right. All those illicit activities, they're connected somehow. You know, I think Chris was mentioning that, and I think Krista was mentioning that. Very often you have someone trafficking in wildlife and using those proceedings to finance something even darker. You know? And then you see the links to of the different criminal activities. Another thing that was not mentioned too much, but something we need to look at as international community is the use of cryptocurrencies. And what is something well, what's behind that? No, I think some people get very excited they can make a quick buck out of cryptocurrencies, but states, governments are looking more and more into this. And I think as part of the OECD, we have also looking at the financial sector and how we can work together to make sense of all that.
Well, and blockchain more generally as a way to secure supply chains. I mean, if there's a positive and a negative.
Absolutely.
Right.
So thanks for your question, because indeed, this is the type of things that the OECD was designed to do, and I think, I dare say, has been quite good about doing when there is the political will from its member countries.
Thank you. Very interesting work. I'm Sean Donnelly from the U.S. Council for International Business, which is the U.S. business counterpart in the BAC, the Business Advisory Group. And I had two questions. One, is this report now online, or will it soon be? And if so, could you give us the coordinates for it? But my other point is, if someone said to me the OECD is doing work on illicit trade, I wouldn't instinctively think it would be in the governance committee. I'd be thinking of other places. So I guess I just wonder, how much consultation have you done with the trade committee, with the bribery working group, and also with the private sector through business, through BIAC or otherwise? But it looks very interesting. Thanks.
Sure. And again, USCIB has been a great partner in advancing exactly this type of work that I mentioned. And I think it's good that we have Tina here, because this whole work derives from the work we do on risk, on risk mitigation, on resilience, on managing of risks, and of course this is a governance issue. Governments have to put in place the right mechanisms so they can detect and manage those risks. The task force that is chaired by Tina, again, and all OECD member countries participate, but also some private sector are invited to some of the meetings. Even though it's housed in the public governance directorate that I had, it involves, if I'm not mistaken, about 10 or 12 different policy areas, and you mentioned two. You mentioned trade, you mentioned the issue of anti-bribery, but also includes transportation, nuclear, innovation, on the digital side. I mean, you name it. Chemicals, so natural disasters, consumer. So again, it's a very broad activity, happens to be housed in the governance directorate, but perhaps Tina, who is really chairing this whole work and has this helicopter view of all the different aspects of the work, she can probably much better place than I am to give you a little bit of a taste of why this is done.
So I think the bottom line answer to your question is yes, it is integrated, and within OECD they do work, and the High-Level Risk Forum and the task force under it does work across the varying directorates of OECD. Why public governance? Again, in my mini history lesson, I mentioned that this was a grassroots effort by the part of the nations. They felt that there was a critical need to have governments focusing on what are critical risks and how do you manage those critical risks. And the 2014 ministerial issuance of the OECD guidelines on critical risks includes this type of risk as one of the ones that it's important for governments to look at and to develop policies and frameworks to address. So it's in the context of looking at what are those critical risks that face governments that this belongs where it is, but it does in fact integrate across the other areas.
Yes, there's a gentleman here in front and then back.
Thank you, Frédéric Badet, with the Sanofi. I just would like to mention that illicit trade is not only limited to IP. And for example, the production of and trafficking of falsified, unlicensed medical product is really a global phenomenon that severely endanger public health, public safety, and economic security. If tomorrow in Africa or in China we will provide to consumer a substandard antibiotic, this will increase antimicrobial resistance, and you might have a resistant infection in the US. So it's really global. And the network are criminal network, and you make 1,000 times more money trafficking drugs than trafficking cocaine. So we need to act, and we need to act quickly.
I'm going to ask Chris Martin to address that, but you're absolutely right. Illicit trade is not limited to intellectual property or counterfeiting, and that's why the task force looks at a broad range of what I call illicit trafficking or illicit trade issues, everything from drug trafficking to wildlife trafficking to a number of different areas, human smuggling, etc. But I'd ask Chris to address that particular point.
Thank you. Yes, just to reiterate the point made by Tina, I think the strength and the success of the task force has been in this breadth of scope. So it has looked at counterfeit and pirated goods, of course, but it's also considered other prohibitions and restrictions, from narcotics to firearms to people trafficking to pharmaceuticals and so on. And I think all of that is entirely relevant to the question of convergence, which I think goes back to the first question, if I may say. So the relationship, that nexus between all aspects of illicit trade with corruption and terror is well understood. And you mentioned the Global Magnitsky Act, which I would also mention that, that's an example of being imaginative and using all tools, powers, capabilities to attack, if you like, all aspects of illicit trade at every point of the supply chain. So I'm reminded, when we talk about corruption, that in 2016 the US Treasury designated an organization, the Wahed organization, as drugs kingpins. They were operating in Panama. The Wahed family and I think 65 separate commercial entities with which they were associated were so designated. Many of those were situated within the Cologne Free Trade Zone, and in fact one of the Wahed family was the chair of the Cologne Free Trade Zone Traders Association. So I think that provides further evidence of the extent to which serious crime is within free trade zones, and that breadth of illicit trade and its convergence with a whole range of other crime types.
Yeah, and if we limited ourselves to only looking at one type of illicit trade, we're going to be missing those people and enablers that are common across many. With, again, the main motivation for many of these, as Piotr so nicely said, is money. Lots of money.
If I can add one thing, that's exactly the case. But at the OECD, we want to make sure that the results that we provide are robust and refer to a thing. We don't want to guess what's the scale of other sectors. But by no means I want to convince you that the numbers I presented are everything. No. This is just a share of a pie of a bigger problem. So you should not interpret the numbers that I showed you today as covering the whole range of illicit trade. No, this is something that we know that we can measure. But there is lots of different sectors and lots of different effects that go beyond what we've seen today. So I would say these are at least the numbers, not average numbers.
And I would say, since we're in the United States, I would say that that's why we have an executive order with respect to transnational organized crime, and also it's part of our new national security strategy as well.
Yes, there's a gentleman in the back.
I'll just create a straw man for you, and then you can poke at it. And that is, all of this work seems terribly siloed. Let me give you an example. World Health Organization got a protocol on illicit trade. Will begin work probably this summer in August. They're going to do their own research. There's the World Customs Organization spending a lot of time on e-commerce, crossover there. So how much cross-fertilization is there? And I don't mean just passive kinds of pick up an OECD report and refer to it in your own research. How much of sort of intervention or even invited intervention exists?
Do you want to? Okay, go ahead. Myself. Okay, thank you. So many of the organizations that you mentioned and others are active participants in the work of the task force. So there is a lot of cross-fertilization, and there has been a great attempt to integrate with the work. Like the World Customs Organization, for example, has participated in each of the task force meetings, and they've provided a lot of very good data and leadership with respect to a number of these issues. So there has been an attempt. We may not have integrated with every international organization, but with a vast majority of the ones that are working in this area. And we continue, as we hear of others that are doing efforts, to integrate that. And in fact, recently Chris mentioned something that was going on in the UK, and we reached out and made sure that that was integrated as well.
And maybe I could briefly add to that. Am I on?
Yeah, you're on.
Yeah, I think that was an area of particular interest to me as I looked at the work that had been going on within the World Customs Organization with regard to the growing movement of goods occasioned by the digital environment or e-commerce. The data and the information here in the OECD report, I think, will be invaluable as a foundational sort of element for the policy deliberations going on and the prescriptions in the World Customs Organization. I think it's early days right now, but one of the areas that Chris and I are very much thinking about is to utilize an existing memorandum of agreement or understanding, I don't know which, between the WCO and the OECD to ensure that there's even more robust engagement between the two. I think the OECD folks actually chair one of the sub-working groups within the WCO group that's looking at e-commerce, but having their expertise and sort of the data that they use and the analysis that they can bring to bear perhaps permeate some of the other groups as well as the resulting policy prescriptions is something that Chris and I are very much interested in further exploring.
Okay, if you allow me, Mr. Vishal Amin is here with us. So he'll come in, make a presentation, then we can continue with the Q&A. Mr. Amin, thank you very much for being with us.
Good morning, and thank you for the kind introduction. I'd like to thank the OECD for organizing this event and for inviting me to speak to all of you today. And congratulations on the launch of your new report. At the White House, my office is broadly focused on working to help find new ways to help us grow our economy and drive innovation. And as an administration, we are all working together to ensure effective coordination and development of the U.S. government's overall intellectual property policy and strategy domestically and abroad. Intellectual property underpins nearly every aspect of our economy. It supports good-paying jobs, it supports the arts, sciences, and technology, and it creates a framework that allows new industries and innovations to flourish. We're focused on ensuring a level playing field for innovators and creators where their innovations and creations are respected and protected, and for systems to be in place that allow them to operate in a free, fair, and open marketplace, ensuring that they have a full and fair opportunity to use and profit from their IP around the globe. To promote America's innovative and creative economy, the administration is engaging with our trading partners, making effective use of all of our authorities, including our trade tools, supporting increased law enforcement cooperation, and engaging and partnering with private sector and other stakeholders. Innovators and creators must be able to operate in markets that provide them with clear paths to secure and use their intellectual property. Foreign actors must not be allowed to profit off of the theft or misappropriation of American IP. We can all agree that intellectual property is integral to not only our nation's economic competitiveness, but to the overall growth of the global innovative economy. Overall, we must ensure that we have a well-functioning IP system, not only in the U.S., but throughout the globe. Well-functioning copyright, patent, trademark, and trade secret systems are essential. As the OECD report recognizes, today's IP environment is challenged by fast-paced technological innovation, changes in methods of doing business, and globalization. Economic globalization, especially with a fast-growing e-commerce sector, is creating increases in supply and demand while simultaneously speeding up the flow of capital and goods around the world. These same forces put a strain on international mail and express shipments as they are becoming increasingly exploited to commit fraud and illicit activity. In fact, as of 2015, the express environment accounted for over half of all U.S. IP-related seizures. To stem the flow of counterfeit and illicit goods, this is an area that must be addressed and one that will require cooperation with our trading partners and industry. But it is clear that approaches that may have worked well in the past may not adequately address new IP challenges. That is why we need to think about what has been working and how we can improve. The OECD report calls on governments to evaluate their efforts and look for opportunities to coordinate among themselves to address the ever-increasing growth of counterfeiting and other IP-related crimes. We need to look at ways to strengthen our partnerships, both within our own government, with our trading partners, and with the private sector and other stakeholders. Illicit actors, including sophisticated criminal organizations, are exploiting weaknesses in IP enforcement regimes around the globe to maximize their ill-gotten gains. They target and misappropriate trade secrets, exploit copyrighted content online, and move counterfeit, infringing, and pirated merchandise across borders, all to the detriment of innovative and creative industries. Those actors engaging in IP-based illicit activity can take advantage of outdated governmental structures that are often unable to monitor and respond effectively to rapidly changing environments and criminal tactics. In order to ensure that the U.S. government's efforts are focused and well coordinated and that resources are being used effectively and efficiently, we are constantly asking ourselves three important questions. What are we doing well? What isn't working? And what should we be doing? We are using existing tools to ensure that our IP laws are enforced and preventing counterfeit and infringing goods from entering our borders. We are engaging with our trading partners and our stakeholders to fight IP infringement at its source. We are encouraging law enforcement cooperation to protect supply chains and promote public health and safety. We are working across the executive branch to help take a targeted, practical, and comprehensive approach to the United States' overall IP strategy, to promote innovation and creativity, and to ensure effective intellectual property protection and enforcement domestically and abroad. While there may be a variety of factors that contribute to a country's challenges in effective IP enforcement, as the OECD report and others note, countries lacking meaningful intragovernmental coordination, either at the policy level, operational level, or both, are often the countries that are facing some of the most pressing challenges in the area of effective and efficient IP enforcement. The OECD report suggests that governments need to strengthen their cooperation to effectively counter illicit trade, including IP violations. In fact, strengthening such cooperation with our trading partners has been and continues to be an important part of our efforts. One example of our existing cooperation is the IPR Center, which is led by ICE Homeland Security Investigations. The IPR Center brings together 19 key federal agencies and 4 international law enforcement partners, namely Interpol, Europol, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and the Mexican Revenue Service. The IPR Center has been a powerful tool in combating IP violations. In addition to increasing intelligence and law enforcement information sharing with our trading partners, we also look to increase capacity building activities for our international counterparts. By assisting our trading partners to become better at identifying and countering IP violations, we can reduce the overall theft of IP. In particular, our global network of IP-focused law enforcement attachés, or IPLEX, provides training and capacity building for foreign prosecutors, judges, and police in places like Hong Kong and China, Brazil, Romania, Thailand, and Nigeria. The relationships that these attachés have developed with local law enforcement has led to greater cooperation, resulting in multiple overseas prosecutions of trademark counterfeiting and copyright piracy. As part of our embassy teams, we also have IP attachés stationed throughout the world. Like our law enforcement attachés, these individuals similarly conduct IP-related capacity-building activities with foreign governments and work regularly with foreign government officials on all facets of IP. For example, our attachés work to secure high-quality IP provisions in host country laws and additionally monitor the implementation and application of these provisions. Further, we have attachés in our embassies from DHS, USTR, the Agriculture Department, and other agencies that work as part of our embassy IP teams. Our embassy teams are another means through which we can continue to strengthen our cooperation with foreign governments. Finally, the most important aspect of strengthening our IP-related partnerships with foreign governments is through our trade policy. By promoting robust IP policies and enforcement, we can encourage foreign governments to not only have solid IP legislation in place, but also effectively enforce it. Similarly, as the OECD report discusses, free trade zones present unique opportunities for illicit trade to flourish. Governments are increasingly looking at facilitating trade and economic development by creating FTZs. However, while FTZs support trade, their proliferation has also attracted the interest of criminal actors that take advantage of the relaxed oversight and softened customs controls to manufacture and distribute counterfeit goods. We need to work together to consider various ways in which we can stem the abuse of these free trade zones by illicit businesses. The OECD report also identifies one final area that I'd like to speak about today: public-private partnerships. The report mentions how cooperation with stakeholders is essential. Stakeholders are an important part of our intellectual property efforts and can help complement research done by governments on infringement and contribute to policy development and implementation. One of the unique aspects of combating trade in counterfeit and pirated goods is that it requires engaging and partnering with our private sector stakeholders whose rights are exploited, impacting businesses, consumers, and national interests alike. It is also important for law enforcement to continue to enhance its means of stopping ever-changing illicit trade practices. Federal law enforcement will never be able to seize its way out of the problem alone. Rather, effective IP enforcement must include tools and resources to identify and interdict counterfeit and pirated goods and investigate and prosecute those who traffic in them. The need for industry support has evolved from strictly aiding in infringement determinations to serving as a tactical partner alongside federal agencies. Working in partnership with the private sector, federal law enforcement officials are able to leverage industry knowledge and expertise to improve enforcement efforts. No one knows how a product is being imitated better than a rights holder. Leveraging data from a broader range of sources leads to more comprehensive risk profiles, better risk segmentation, and more actionable intelligence. The intelligence gained allows agencies like CBP and ICE to better utilize targeting capabilities, detect bad actors earlier in the supply chain, respond to risks on a real-time basis, and anticipate new threats before they fully emerge. The administration also continues to examine opportunities to engage with stakeholders on existing industry-led voluntary initiatives to protect IP and to look at new areas for cooperation. Engaging and partnering with private sector stakeholders is essential. As part of the White House's IP policy development efforts, we're working to engage with stakeholders, develop new initiatives, examine legislative priorities, and find creative solutions. The United States recognizes the advantages that strong partnerships provide to protect IP. I hope this OECD report helps further continued dialogue and action that we can all build on in a positive direction to effectively address IP concerns globally. Once again, it was great to share a few of my thoughts with you today, and congratulations on launching this report. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for this intervention. Just before you came, we are saying, giving a number of examples on how much we can achieve internationally with U.S. leadership. And I think after hearing you, I'm sure that on the IP area, we'll continue this long tradition, and I think we'll continue to work closely together with the U.S. To move forward on and you gave us a great roadmap on areas where we need to work together internationally, and the OECD, of course, is delighted to continue to serve the U.S. and other member countries in moving this agenda forward. Mr. Amin, I don't know if you still have a little bit of time to stay with us, because we have a very active audience who are grilling us with very difficult questions. So,
Then we'd love to share with you.
So we have reinforcements now on this side of the table. So if you allow us a few minutes of Q&A, and perhaps if you have any questions to Mr. Amin at this moment, would you be okay with that?
I'll take the easy questions.
Okay, so
You can through the hard ones this way, you know.
So I think this gentleman here had one question, then the gentleman in the back. Yes.
Hi, Vishal. Nice to see you again, Tony Carroll. One of it's an impressive report. Congratulations, and I look forward to getting into the details. But as a person who spends much of my professional life over the last 40 years in working in and out of African trade, and encountering problems, whether it be in pharmaceuticals, whether it be in smuggled products of all sorts, the capacity is still very lacking. And I'm just wondering, as we look at holes in this report and holes in the global distribution of illicit goods, how much are we spending on trying to enhance capacity within these countries? For example, Nigeria, a country the British operate extensively in, Nigeria has fewer customs agents than exist in Heathrow, in the Heathrow complex, and a country of 180 million people. Where do we begin and where do we start? The DRC borders 9 countries. DRC is a very uncharted territory in terms of transshipped and international goods. So I'm just wondering, if we are looking at a robust global effort, are we spending enough time in enhancing trade capacity and enforcement capacity in these countries? And moreover, are we making it important for those countries to take ownership in this? Because that, frankly, has not been the case in many of these jurisdictions over my 41 years of working in Africa.
Thank you for your question. The point was made earlier about the network of IP attaches and other law enforcement personnel posted around the world. And, of course, the US have a strong international network and global outreach, as do many other administrations, the UK, our French, German, Italian counterparts. And we do try to make best use of that force multiplication. So where we have a presence, that is, the UK have a presence in a country and other trusted partners don't, then we scratch one another's back. So I think that the sum of that outreach within Africa is greater than it might first appear. The question of capacity building is, of course, particularly important. And earlier when we talked about the wildlife trafficking summit in October in London, a big part of that has been looking at the capacity building needs of those countries most affected by wildlife trafficking. And within the context of the free trade zone conversation, we're acutely aware of currently that there are 2 big projects in the Horn of Africa. I think it's Dubai ports who are investing in Somaliland and the Chinese investment in Djibouti. So the race is on to secure the free trade zones within that part of Africa. And wouldn't it be wonderful if the work we're doing in the task force to establish that code of conduct for free trade zones could influence those before they actually are up and running?
Clark Gascoigne with the Financial Accountability and Corporate Transparency Coalition. I want to thank you all for being here today. FACT is a coalition of sort of human rights, anti-corruption organizations. One of the question I have is, as in my conversations with businesses and with law enforcement, the sort of routine way that counterfeiter smugglers hide from enforcement is by setting up anonymous sort of shell companies, anonymous entities to disguise, who they are from law enforcement and from businesses that are trying to do investigations into who's counterfeiting their products. The UK a couple of years ago just sort of took a leadership role on this and decided to require that when you set up a company, you have to disclose who you actually are. So thank you for your leadership on that. But I also have some questions. The EU just has agreed that all 28 member states are going to be collecting who's behind anonymous companies. The U.S. is currently considering legislation in the House that would move forward. Seems like it's going to move forward this Congress. But I just wanted to know: is this something that you're seeing and that's on your radar as something that could help with illicit trade? But then also in the UK, is this something, now that the registry's been online for I think 18 months, is this something that's been useful for your efforts in the UK in countering illicit trade?
Thank you for that question. I'm going to be cynical in my response, because I think a public register of beneficial ownership simply squeezes the problem somewhere else where such public accountability doesn't exist. But I think we can take heart. We've seen over the last couple of years the big data leak or acquisition, the Panama Papers, more recently the Paradise Papers, and that focuses the attention on all of the risks associated with the concealment of true beneficial ownership. Of course, in the US, you have the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act. Meanwhile, elsewhere, the OECD are pushing through the Common Reporting Standard. And I think that is a platform for digging deeper into the obscurity of beneficial ownership. And I think it goes back to the point of using all the tools or powers available to combat illicit trade in all its guises. Let's make good use of tax powers. If we can't interdict the shipments, let's tax the criminals into submission. So I think that the Common Reporting Standard and FATCA will actually enhance our understanding of the beneficial ownership problem, but will also enrich us in terms of the data we have to inform the bigger picture.
And I could say, as a former prosecutor, that I've spent more hours than I care to remember trying to trace through shell companies to who's the actual owner and being able to prove it to put them behind bars. So I think any of the policy type solutions that we can do would save law enforcement countless hours as they're trying to take the bad guys off the street.
Thank you. Any question for Mr. Amin? You're so clear that
I got off easy.
You got off easy.
I'll just supplement something you said. I'm Lisa Dyer from the Department of State, Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs, and Director of the Office of Intellectual Property Enforcement. Just to add, he laid out some really important people who are serving overseas to address intellectual property efforts. We have nearly 1,000 economic officers overseas. Mr. Martin, thank you for referring to them, who are there to help. So please, if you have any issues, please make those resources available to you. Let them know what your concerns are. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Cindy Braden, and I'm here representing a new organization called the Transnational Alliance to Combat Illicit Trade. And it's a not-for-profit independent organization, and we have businesses who are across industry sectors who are going to be working together, sharing best practices and data, and in an advocacy way to help combat illicit trade for obvious reasons. My question for you today is, and this is a terrific report and will provide a lot of valued background and pointers for where we go from here. My question is, how are you working currently with the e-commerce platforms and the various shippers, postal services, Amazons, etc. Currently? Thank you.
So I can tell you that the task force has worked closely with the e-commerce suppliers over the years. It's one of the areas that the task force has looked at. I don't know if anyone has any specific comments you want to talk about.
If you don't
Take
mind.
mine.
Yes, hi, thank you. Just on the question of e-commerce, and back to, I'll labour the point about using all the tools in the box, of course, so using tax powers. So, in the United Kingdom in April, we'll introduce a due diligence scheme for fulfilment houses because of the supplies of goods through e-commerce, through some of the big online marketplaces where sellers, some overseas sellers, 60% of them in China, are securing a significant advantage over the lawful competition because they're not accounting for value-added tax at 20% in the UK. So we'll use this scheme, the due diligence scheme, to better control the fulfilment houses, and at the same time Finance Act legislation allows for joint and several liability, which means that if the online seller doesn't play the game, the tax burden will pass to the online marketplace, the Amazons and the eBays. So I think there'll be better due diligence on their part to take the illicit actors out of the supply chain.
Yeah, the other area that the task force has looked at is the actual shippers themselves, because obviously when you're ordering something from an Amazon, it's a UPS or a FedEx or whatever that's often delivering those. And so we've partnered with shippers in the past, and it's actually quite interesting to look at the trajectory over the 5 years that the task force has existed. I guess 5+ years that it's existed, because in the early days we looked at whether air was the right way that things were being transported, and it was actually more by sea. And then over time, as e-commerce got more and more, we found, oh, look at this. The individualized and small package shipments are going in different directions in terms of transportation routes. So we have invited some of the shippers at various times to the task force meetings, and it sounds like your organization might be benefit from joining us on March 14th and 15th in Paris at the illicit trafficking meeting.
Please.
I've got The Economist in my sights over here. My name is Amy Strauss. I work for DHS. I know a few of us have talked about the WCO e-commerce safe framework. Did you find in the analysis any impact that a framework had from an international body that has some sort of effect or impact? Is there a benefit found for these types of frameworks?
Want to just take a mic here?
I think it works. Okay, it's an excellent question. But I believe, let me just recall what I said, that we are very cautious in drafting our results. And our results are very conservative. So whatever we draft, whatever we put in numbers, it's really secure. So it's really something that we are certain about. To your point, of course, we'd love to study the impacts of such frameworks on performance of illicit trade, on whether they have impact or not, but I'm afraid that there is not enough data to study these issues. But at the same time, as I mentioned, later this year, we will work together with the EU IP office. We'll try to look more in depth onto the issue of e-commerce and small parcels. And I do not promise anything that I cannot fulfill, so I will not say that we will address it, but we'll certainly ask the data, or as my friends from the UI will say, we'll torture the data as long as they speak.
Yes, gentleman in the back.
Hi, Dave Snyder. I represent Property Casualty Insurers Association of America. Question, do you have some recommendations for the insurance sector in specific, or do you have recommendations generally for the private sector in terms of their governance, that is corporate governance? Thank you.
I don't think the task force has gone that far. We, of course, at the OECD have the insurance committee that works on the issue on those issues, and they have very extensive work that has been done on the issues related to insurance. But and they do participate in the task force, but I don't think the task force has gone that deep, at least not yet. But I don't know, Tina may perhaps come.
Yeah, the only thing I would say is that the work of the Public Governance Committee and the Task Force and the High Level Risk Forum is focused more on the governance pertaining to governments. However, in doing that, we've worked closely, as Marcos mentioned, with the private sector. And so there have been dialogue and discussions in the context of varying task force meetings about best practices, if you will, that private sector could engage in, which would enhance and contribute to, sort of solving the overarching problem, but not in terms of drafting something in terms of best governance.
Okay, well, if there are no further questions, I'd like to again thank the panelists for their presentations. Mr. Amin, thank you for being with us. Piotr, excellent work, you and your team. Watch that space. The OECD will continue to work on those issues at the request of its members. And Mr. Amin gave us what, in effect, is a roadmap for moving this forward. I think if you look at the priorities going forward for our work, the issue of free trade zones, we examine how far can we go, what kind of guidance we can provide, what shape it will take to work with the different free trade zones. And remember, free trade zones take many shapes, many forms. There are free trade zones inside of the U.S., in Europe. There are, of course, some countries which are the whole country is a free trade zone. But we continue to work very close on this issue. Again, very, very important issue. The issue of small parcels, again, another area where will merit some dialogue, and to see whether we can move towards some consensus on measures that we can take to secure and facilitate law enforcement with small parcels. And last but not least, we continue to engage with countries which are not members of the OECD, and we have here today a part of the report. We did look at some enforcement frameworks in BRICS countries. Very, very important to engage with those countries to try to understand their perspective. Again, they are part of the solution. Working with them, so we will also be in our future work streams to have activities where we can bring them for dialogue. So with that, thank you very much for being with us. I think that was quite interesting.